Mr. J. Moore.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Yeah, I thought we would talk a little bit about the history of the library today, and we're going to start way back there. James Lowry, who was the editor of the Taylor County News back in the 1880s, he began when Abilene was just 8 years old to campaign for a library in Abilene. This was one of his little notes he put in his paper. It says, Abilene has churches of nearly all denominations and young men's prayer meetings each week. But there's one thing still lacking, and that is a public reading room with a good circulating library. Now, I know that you all can read, so you didn't need me to read that to you, but y'all are friends of the library, and that's reading, so this is story hour for y'all, all right? 3 months after he published that, a library got started here in March. It was announced that a 250-volume library would be located at the Adair and Clark's jewelry store on Pine Street. They're on the west side in the 100 block of Pine Street. They had 149 of the 250 books were copies of the Congressional Record. So, says it was reported that Mr. Adair of Adair and Clark has constructed a neat bookcase in which to keep the city library. So there it is. The whole thing is in one neat little bookcase. And then after that, he's commanded us to all go to the play. I don't think it showed that on there, but I forgot to do it. Yeah, go to the play tonight. I don't know what the play was, but you were supposed to go. But that early effort did not last very long. I'm not really sure why. I guess people didn't want to read about what Congress was doing, but pretty soon our neat little bookcase was empty. So then you fast forward 9 years to 1898. That's J.M. Wagstaff, who had moved here from Buffalo Gap. Judge Wagstaff was an Abilene attorney who pushed for a new effort. And he says that the public library meeting last Monday night resulted in the donation of over 100 volumes as a nucleus around which to build a fine library. The old Armory Hall on Pine Street has been fitted up and seated for the library in the reading room. That building you see right below that, that is the 200 block of Pine Street, and what the Armory Hall was upstairs in the middle of that block, what they called the Union Block, because the buildings were all put together. Anyway, he got it going, and then just a few months later, the Library Association should meet and attend a business that is rapidly ruining it. This is the exact situation. So apparently that one didn't go over very well either, because within a very short amount of time, that too had closed. So it was time to turn things over to the women. Next up to bat, they came. It says, our women's clubs take high rank in the state and should serve as an example to our men who have no literary organization. Unless we count the lately organized but poorly worked Literary and Library Association. So the women got to work. They put their hats on. There they are. There were 3 local women's clubs who joined together. The Shakespeare Club, which is who you see in the picture there, that's the Shakespeare Club. Then there was the 21 Club and the Round Table Club. And those 3 women's clubs joined together in a federation. And it was called the Women's Federation. And they shamefaced those men because, in fact, this is Emily Cockrell right there, for whom her family is Cockrell Street in East Abilene. She was a member of the original library board, and she was its secretary, and it was her idea to join the women's clubs together. Here's a much better and larger picture of the group of the Women's Federation. I'm not sure what he's doing in the picture, but the rest of them are members of the Women's Federation. Right here is, I believe, Lutie Bradfield. She was the first president of the Women's Federation, and she was a ball of fire. I'm not positive that's her, but she looked pretty determined. So I'm thinking that might be Lutie Bradfield. This is what she looked like later in life, and it does kind of resemble her. But at the very first meeting, in addition to them starting a library, Lutie Bradfield gave an address. And in her address, she said, why can't Abilene women start the ball a-rolling by which Phantom Hill may be set apart for a state reserve or a park? Why not memorialize the TMP Railroad to beautify their right-of-way through our city? I think she was way ahead of her time, don't you? That didn't come for a long time. And Mrs. Bradfield also shot off a letter to Andrew Carnegie in New York. And Mr. Carnegie's secretary replied, and basically he said, y'all are doing great work, but your city's too small, so I'm not going to give you any money. So he didn't do that. So the women got busy, though. They bought a house that was located right here. This is the Will Stith home. It actually faced east. And the Stiths donated, well, they didn't donate their house, they sold it for $3,000. They built a new house just a few blocks this way. But this is where the city library, or the Carnegie Library, as we'll find out, got its start. So anyway, they also filed a 50-year charter. In 1906, the Women's Federation filed with the state of Texas for a 50-year charter establishing what was known as the Abilene Federation Library Association. Then in 1906, Jim and Bessie Radford from Abilene were in New York City, and I'm sure Lutie Bradfield told them, go by Andrew Carnegie's house and knock on the door. So that's Andrew Carnegie's house, and they went by and knocked on the door. And she later recalled, Mrs. Radford, when we arrived at the home, we were informed Mr. Carnegie was in Scotland. The doorman took our names and our mission, and in a very few minutes, Mr. Carnegie's secretary entered the room. He was a small, jovial Scotchman with a pronounced brogue. He asked many questions of our state, county, and town. He promised to lay our request before Mr. Carnegie upon his return from Scotland. And she says he did so some 6 weeks later. So there's Mr. Carnegie. He got back home. Presumably he unpacked his bag. The secretary rushed up and laid our request before him. We had asked for $20,000. Mr. Carnegie gave Abilene $17,500 in March of 1908 to start the library. He expected us to raise some of the money, and he also expected us to raise money to finance the operation of it. We were so excited about that when we wrote it in the paper, we forgot how to hyphenate the word library. I don't think that's right. Anyway, the Stith home was demolished to make way for Mr. Carnegie's new library, and construction got started in the summer of 1908. By December, near Christmas, they had just about bricked up to the second floor windows when they stopped to put the cornerstone in place. You can see it right there. The cornerstone read, erected by Andrew Carnegie through efforts of women's clubs, 1908. I emailed Julie to ask her if perhaps the library still had the cornerstone somewhere. Do any of you all have the cornerstones at your house? No one seems to know where the cornerstone is, but apropos for a library, it says that they laid the cornerstone quietly. So, also behind the cornerstone was a time capsule, a metal box, which they put several things in. One was the volumes of the yearbooks for the three women's clubs, also the newspapers at the time. They put in a $18.99 half dollar. They put in 4 2-cent stamps, I'm not sure why. And they put in the calling card of Mrs. George Walsh. Her name was Sarah. Sarah Walsh, she lived just 2 blocks this way where today is the First Baptist Family Life Center. Anyway, she was supposed to be there when they put the box in, and she was late in arriving because she had been out shopping. And suddenly she rushed up because she realized she was holding things up, and she dropped her business card or her calling card into the metal box, and she gathered up her things and rushed on down the street to her house. Then they got ready to put the box behind the cornerstone, and no one could find the lid to the metal box. They kept looking around, and in just a little bit, they heard Mrs. Walsh yelling, "Yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo," coming back from her house with the lid that she had accidentally taken home with her as well. So, the Andrew Carnegie Library here, over the door it said Carnegie Public Library, AD 08. It was a red brick building, had those 2 solid limestone columns which were quarried at Looters. Big wide eaves. The basement actually was it was just a dirt floor basement as it was intended to be. I don't know if you can tell in that picture or not, but the front door is standing open. And we are proud, that is just about the time it opened, and we planted some little scrawny trees out there in the front, hoping that those things would take off. Here's another view of the library looking to the north or northwest. And here's the 1911 First Baptist Church sanctuary, which today is the site of their fellowship hall. By the way, this big building right here was the skating rink in Abilene. It had a big wood floor. Mr. Carnegie funded some 2,500 libraries worldwide. He funded only in English-speaking countries. I'm not sure why. He funded 32 in Texas. You've probably seen this one right there, which was built in Ballinger in 1909 and is still the library for Ballinger. Stanford got a Carnegie Library in 1908, and it too is still their library. Brownwood had one. They tore it down in 1965. The earliest one in Texas, and I think one of the prettiest ones is in Bryan down there, the Carnegie Library. Today it's the home of their County Historical Association, I believe. This is the Carnegie Library in Washington, D.C. Here's another view of it. I don't know if you can see or not, but right there is the Apple logo, because today it's an Apple store. It is no longer the library there. Here's the inside of the reading room at the Pittsburgh Library, which Mr. Carnegie funded, and they have those off to the side there. You can see those tables with those beautiful green shaded library lamps on them. Well, we had a couple lamps in our library too. This is the inside of the Carnegie Library on the first floor on one end of the building. This is the other end of the building. You might recognize this early search engine that's off to the side there. Upstairs on the second floor was the children's reading room. I'll let you look at that for a minute. You're like, he goes too fast. By 1927, the library had 14,000 volumes in it. There were 7,000 local card holders. They would loan out on average 4,000 books a month. And if you look, you can see our trees have grown from the earlier picture there. They're looking much better. It was a beautiful building. The man in charge of keeping it clean was this man. His name was Hjalmar Lilius, and he was from Stockholm, Sweden. He came to the United States in 1869 when he was 28 years old. Back home in Sweden, someone who lived in his neighborhood had been to the United States and had gone back home to visit. And that man was telling everybody that he came across of all the opportunities that there were in America. And so when that man left to come back, he brought with him 20 young men from Stockholm, Sweden, and Mr. Lilius was one of them. The man happened to be, was the grandfather of Charles Lindbergh, who also was, his family's from Sweden. But, so Mr. Lilius came to this part of Texas in the 1870s. He became the custodian at the Carnegie Library when it opened in 1909, and he worked there for 20 years until he retired at the age of 87. The newspaper here tried many times to do a story on him, and he always begged off and said he didn't want the publicity. And he also asked them that when he dies to please not put a notice in the newspaper. They did not obey. They put it on the front page of the newspaper. But you may be wondering if Lilius Street is named for him. In fact, it is named for him, and it is misspelled. I don't know why we got that extra L in there, but we do. Don't even get me started about that. He did not live on Lilius Street. He actually lived on South 3rd, and we did not misspell that one. His son Elam lived here for a long time, and Mr. Elam Lilius, his wife was Mabel, and you might know Mabel if you ever played bridge, because Mabel Lilius Bridge Center at Rose Park is Hjalmar's daughter-in-law. When he did die, here's what it said in the paper. I know you can't read that. It says, throughout his life, Mr. Lilius was an insatiable reader, and as custodian of the Carnegie Library here for nearly 20 years, he found constant pleasure in the companionship of books. After his resignation from library duties in September of the past year, he continues to go regularly to the building for hours of reading. I think he's y'all's kind of guy, our kind of guy, a library guy. Another name associated with the library is Eugenia Pickard. This is Mrs. Pickard. She came to Abilene in the early 1900s. She was very slight. In fact, one article in the paper said a good wind could blow her over. But Mrs. Pickard owned a lot of rental property in Abilene. When she died in 1945, she left her property to the city of Abilene, asking that they would sell it and use the proceeds to build a school in Abilene. Well, the money that she left was not sufficient to build a school. But when Woodson Junior and Senior High was built in 1953, her estate, which had grown to some $13,000, was used to fund the library, which is through that door right there. And of course, the Eugenia Pickard Library still exists over at the Woodson Center for Excellence. It was a branch of the public library 3 years after it opened. So from 1956 until 1995, that was actually a branch location of the library. If you go there today, Mrs. Pickard's portrait hangs on the wall there, and they'll be glad for you to come by. In 1956, you folks got started. 27 interested citizens showed up at the City Hall, which was just right across the street here. Anybody that showed up was considered a charter member. If you couldn't be there, you could write a letter and ask to be a charter member because you were busy. Several people did. The very first president of the Friends of the Library was Ruth Hodges. She taught government and history at McMurray for a number of years, and she also served as the assistant librarian at McMurray. Her granddaughter happened to be in my class, the same class as Becky's, Karen Hodges. But Here is the library in about 1955. Across the street from it, where the parking lot is today, is where the City Hall once was. Here's the old First Baptist Sanctuary, and of course you recognize the Grace Museum right there. Just behind us, right here, was the Bluebird Inn. The Bluebird Inn was built in 1915, and for years it was the oldest eating establishment in Abilene. That's where the lunch crowd went back in those days for lunch. There was no Cypress Street station, so you went to the Bluebird, isn't that right? It was family style when you went there. But here's a good color picture of the Carnegie Library. I like that picture. The guy left his bicycle against our tree. Look how big those trees are getting in that picture now. But it was owned and operated by the Women's Federation. It was not a city library. It was known as the Carnegie Public Library, but it was not publicly owned. In 1956, after their 50-year charter was up, the Ladies Federation decided that rather than renew it, that they would give the property to the city, and that the city of Abilene would take over the operations of the Carnegie Library, which they did on January the 1st of 1956, and that's when it became known as the Abilene Public Library. 11 months later, there was a bond issue here, and it passed, the library part of it, which was $700,000, passed by 57 to 43%. They said, let's build a library that will last us for 20 years, so you can see we're getting our money out of that. The Carnegie Library had to shove their shelves together. Instead of being 3 feet apart, they were 26 inches apart. They only had room for 81 chairs, that was it. They had 36,000 volumes at the time. So we needed a new library. This is them dismantling the old library. They didn't really demolish it as much as they dismantled it. They tried to take it apart in pieces. I do not know what happened to those 2 pillars, which were the last things to really come down. And the dismantling happened in 1958. They did save the brick, and you could buy it. And if you want to see some of it, drive by 677 Westwood Street, the home 1960 of John and Joanne Hamill. And that is some of the old Carnegie Library brick right there. Don't get out of your car and walk up. Just look at it from the street, though. But when the building was dismantled, they retrieved the time capsule from behind the cornerstone. That is Mr. Baldridge. Vic Baldridge at the time was the president of the advisory board. To the far left is the librarian, Thelma Andrews. Next to her is Vera Minter. And then Mrs. George McDaniel, who actually had been there the day that they set the cornerstone back there in 1908, and when Mrs. Walsh put her card in there. They took everything out of the box, including the old newspapers, and at the very bottom of the box was Sarah Walsh's business calling card down there. This is a view down Second as that new library was being built. You can still see right behind the library, that's the Bluebird Inn. First Baptist has demolished their sanctuary, and you can see they've got a sidewalk covering past, because they're building their new fellowship hall at the same time that the library went up. So here it is while it's being constructed. While that was happening, they had to move the books somewhere, and they moved the books to this building, which is the corner of Cypress and North First Street. It was known as the Oldham Building. Later it was torn down to build the Reporter News section, which today is dust. In fact, my office at the Grace Museum, and you cannot believe how many hours I spend staring out the window at watching them do that. But the architectural style of the new library was called Good Contemporary, which makes you think there's bad contemporary. I don't know. They had some slowdowns. For one thing, there was a picket by some union workers that slowed it down. They discovered that underground water, when they dug out the basement, there was a cave-in, which actually pinned a man for a while, but he was okay. And 3 months of bad weather. So they were pretty far behind on the library. But it opened on January the 18th of 1960 at 9 o'clock. And within the first hour, 43 books had been checked out. Most people were anxious, though, to drive around back and use the drive-up facility, which we had never had that before. It also, as you can see, featured the planter boxes around the exterior, but those planter boxes caused some foundation problems, so they were replaced with a stone wall. The city spent $5,200 in 1979 to put that on there, and I think it's the worst $5,200 we ever spent. But the trees are looking good again. Here's a list of the city librarians. They are all women, except one, because I think the men had showed they couldn't run the library. The first one was Nellie Cannon. Nellie Cannon's granddaughter still lives here in Abilene. A lot of you probably know Eleanor Hoppy. That is her grandmother, and Mrs. Cannon was paid $5 a month. Number 3, Ella Redding, got $8 a month. Finally, by the time they got to number 4, Emma Taylor, she was making $50 a month. Number 6 was Maud Cole. She served the longest. Maud Cole actually survived the Galveston hurricane of 1900, and she refused to ever go back to Galveston and didn't until 1958. She also was a poet and an author. If you'd like to read her book, which is called Wind Against Stone, you can. It's downstairs in the basement, but it's non-circulating, so you're going to have to sit right there and read it. You probably know that she was the grandmother of Abilene's best-known author, A.C. Green. In 1940, Mrs. Cole asked the library board if she might have the afternoon off so that she could go see the matinee showing of Gone with the Wind. And the matinee tickets didn't cost as much as the evening tickets, which might have been her way of saying you don't pay me enough. So anyway, they approved her request and she went to the showing. Thelma Andrews was number 8. She is the one who was the librarian when this building was built. In fact, she chose the furniture and the interior design. Number 9, Dee Blackman was the sole inept male who tried to run the library. Number 10 and 12 are the same person. Cynthia Woodall later became Cynthia Pirtle. So just like Grover Cleveland, she served non-consecutive terms. So although there have been 15 librarianships, there have been only 14 librarians. And of course, the last one on the list is Julie Hatton, who came in 2020. And you can see I've got her down for a 50-year stint up there. So just a few other notable moments. In 1959, they hired a consultant to look at the library. That consultant made a long-range plan. He said by 1980 that we would have 4 branches here. In 1966, we did actually open a branch at the Sears Recreation Center on Ambler Street. It mostly was just children's book. It only lasted for 3 years. In 1969, we got the larger bookmobile. It was 45 feet long. It could hold 5,000 books. And you might remember it traveled around to not just Taylor County, but the outlying counties as well. And then in 1987, technically it quit becoming a bookmobile because we parked it permanently on Buffalo Gap out there past the mall. In 1980, the mayor, Fred Lee Hughes, along with the Taylor County Historical Commission, opted to see if we would change the name from the Abilene Public Library to the Clack Library in honor of Tommy Clack, who was Mr. Hughes's English teacher at Abilene High. But the advisory board rejected that and the name stayed the same. In 1991, the Abilene Library Consortium linked the public library with all the college libraries, and somebody had to put barcodes on 350,000 books for that to happen. In 1997, there was a Citizens Library Review panel that pushed for a new library after an earlier bond had failed. You might recall that. I didn't want to bring this up, except I think that's a really good picture of my wife, so I'll put that up there. In 1998, though, the Library Review panel did recommend for a branch library in the southwest part of Abilene, and they took the books from the bookmobile and they put them over there in the original location of the South Branch. The last surviving of the 3 women's clubs that was formed way back there was the 21 Club. And by the way, they called themselves the 21 Club because 21 women could fit in a home where they met. But they disbanded in 2013. And when they voted to disband, they had $55 in their account, and they voted to donate it to the Abilene Public Library. When Ludi Bradfield died in 1954 at the age of 94, the library was closed for her service from 10 to noon. So in 2009, the Mockingbird branch opened out there in the Edgewood Shopping Center, the only thing in the shopping center that's not a dollar store. Have you noticed that? There are $3 stores in that one. If you were there that day, it was a cold day, but it was a happy day. You all helped make that happen. I believe you donated $500,000 and raised another $500,000. In 2016, the Southside branch moved to the mall. Many of you were there the day the Cowboy Band came marching through for that. So the Abilene Library has been at South 2nd and Cedar since 1906, going from the Stith Home to the Carnegie Library to this building. But as you well know, the next chapter in the history of our library is going to find it at South 1st and Grape, which is a privately funded and fully furnished library to be located at Abilene Heritage Square. A new chapter in our long history, and I think the best is yet to come for that. So anyway, thank you all for having me, and thanks for listening.